And as we transition from the life of David to the life of his son, let's see whether we think that Solomon is like his father. David, who had a man after God's own heart. How about Solomon? Let's read. When the queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon and his relationship to the Lord, she came to test Solomon with hard questions. And arriving at Jerusalem with a great caravan with camels carrying spices and large quantities of gold and precious stones, she came to Solomon and talked with him about all that she had on her mind. And Solomon answered all of her questions. Nothing was too hard for the king to explain to her. And when the queen of Sheba saw all the wisdom of Solomon and the palace he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his officials, the attending servants in their robes, his cupbearers, and the burnt offerings he made at the temple of the Lord, she was overwhelmed. And she said to the king, "The report I had heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true. But I did not believe these things until I came and saw them with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told me. In wisdom and wealth, you have far exceeded the report I heard." And she gave the king 120 talents of gold, large quantities of spices and precious stones, and never again were so many spices brought in as those the queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. And King Solomon gave the queen of Sheba all she desired and asked for, besides what he had given her out of his royal bounty. And then she left and returned with her retinue to her own country. And then the king made a great throne covered with ivory and overlaid with fine gold. The throne had 6 steps, and its back had a rounded top, and on both sides of the seat were armrests, with a lion standing beside each of them. And 12 lions stood on the 6 steps, one at either side of each step. Nothing like it had ever been made for any other kingdom. All King Solomon's goblets were gold, and all the household articles in the palace of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Nothing was made of silver, because silver was considered of little value in Solomon's days. The king had a fleet of trading ships at sea, along with the ships of Hiram. Once every 3 years it returned carrying gold, silver, and ivory, and apes and baboons. And King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. The whole world sought audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom God had put in his heart. And year after year, everyone who came brought a gift, articles of silver and gold, robes, weapons, and spices, and horses and mules. And Solomon accumulated chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses, which he kept in the chariot cities, and also with him in Jerusalem. And the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and cedar as plentiful as sycamore fig trees in the foothills. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign wives. Besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. And they were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, "You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods." And nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth, and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. And as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods. And his heart was not only fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. And on a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Shamash, the detestable god of Moab, and for Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. And he did the same for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. And the Lord became angry with Solomon, because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Now, though he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. And so the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. And yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen." Well, have you ever been tempted to, drive through one of those sort of exclusive neighborhoods? There you get to see how, sort of the other half lives. Maybe one night you're driving through the neighborhood, you pull over, you sneak through the lawn, and you peer over the fence into the bay windows, and as you look inside, maybe you get to see a beautiful piece of art or a grand piano or some elegant furnishings, or maybe you might even seen the Duke and Duchess of the manor. And there they are being waited on hand and foot by their servants. We humans, we seem to have a fascination with wealth and glamour, don't we? Especially when it comes to royalty. This past week on NBC's The Today Show, they featured Princess Di. She was the wonderful mother of her two now grown sons, William and Harry. And our fascination continues with royalty. A couple of years ago, William, he marries this commoner. Her name is Kate Middleton. Meanwhile, Will's daddy, someday he's going to be the future king when his mama, the queen, passes on. And then William, the oldest son, he'll take his rightful place in time. Of course, royal succession in England is a pretty orderly and predictable thing. As we pick up chapter 13 of the story this week, we find out that in ancient Israel about 3,000 years ago, that wasn't necessarily the case. Let's remember, King David is growing old and feeble, and one of his sons, Adonijah, he sees this. He sees an opportunity to be able to replace dear old dad. And so he makes his move. He calls some of his friends, and he essentially declares himself the king. Let's remember last week, the prophet Nathan, when he came to David and told David of his sin. So once again now, Nathan, he sees what's going on, and he knows that old David had already said that someday that Bathsheba's oldest son, Solomon, would be the king. So Nathan, he has to go to David again and give him some bad news. Hey, David, Israel's got a new king. And his name, it ain't Solomon. And even though David is feeble, nevertheless, he's not timid. So David, he shifts into crisis mode, and he declares Solomon as his choice for king. And he throws this big party with the trumpets blaring and the people calling out, "Long live King Solomon!" And Adonijah, he's just finishing up his own celebration when he hears the crowd roar, and when he learns what's happening. He has sort of one of those uh-oh moments. And he knows that Solomon's first royal act might be turned toward him. And Solomon learns that Adonijah is now hiding out for fear of his life, and so he makes one of those decisions that builds his legacy for his wisdom. He says, if Adonijah shows himself to be worthy, then not a hair will be harmed on his head. But if evil is found in him, then he will die. So David, he passes the leadership baton on to Solomon. And Israel is now in great shape financially. They're strong. There are no wars to kind of tarnish Solomon's popularity rating. If ever there was a time to be the king of Israel, this is it. I mean, it's hard to deny that Solomon has not been handed the keys to the kingdom on a silver platter. And to top it all off, his reign begins with a series of defining events. Because first, get this, folks, he marries the daughter of the Egyptian Pharaoh. I mean, talk about starting out with a bang. Cementing your relationship with an alliance to a superpower like Egypt. Because that means that Ironically, the nation that had once enslaved Israel is now seeking the good graces of God's people. Imagine that. And then another defining event happens because God appears to Solomon in a dream. And he offers to grant Solomon his heart's desire. And so God hands Solomon this blank check. No rules, no off limits, ask for anything, and it's yours. I mean, come on. Let's be honest. If you could have anything, what would it be? Your own island? A diamond mine? Your own golf course? Well, Solomon asks for wisdom. And what's astonishing is that his request is not so much for himself, but for insight to fulfill his duties as the leader of his people. So he tells God, hey, you're giving me this awesome privilege of serving you, but I'm just a mere child. And this nation is huge, so please give me the wisdom to be a just and righteous ruler. And now I'm sort of embarrassed about asking for that golf course. God, he's so pleased with Solomon's request that he not only grants it, but he gives him wealth and he gives him honor and power. And so Solomon's wisdom, we all know it, it becomes the hallmark of his reign. And he ends up writing all of these wise sayings called Proverbs. It's sort of like Warren Buffett, the Oracle of Obama. People come from all around the world and they seek him out. In fact, as we heard in today's lesson, a royal from a neighboring kingdom, the Queen of Sheba, she seeks out Solomon. She hears about his wealth and she had to see it for herself. And so she comes, and in all of her resplendence there is her caravan of animals and servants and all of her belongings. It must have been quite the spectacle. When she sees Solomon's palace and his wealth and his wisdom, she's impressed. She presents him with this incredible array of gifts, gold and spices and precious stones. And with celebrities like the Queen of Sheba tweeting about her visit, all of the other celebrities from all over the region, they start showing up. And it turns out to be a circus. I mean, Solomon, he's like the Dalai Lama and Bill Gates and LeBron James and Prince William all rolled up into one. And everybody who's kissing his feet, they're bringing him more gifts, more gold and spices and jewels and ivory and animals. Solomon, he's the king of the world. It all started out so well, including the fact that dear old Daddy David wanted to build the Lord a temple. But God told David, that's not for you to do. That's for your son. And so just 4 years into his reign, Solomon starts building this place for God to live in. And the construction project, it was massive. It took 7 years to build. And Solomon followed the pattern of the tabernacle, that beautiful tent that they had traveled with God with in the days of Moses. The result of it all was as majestic a place of worship as you would ever want to imagine, the temple. And so with great reverence, Solomon, he brought the Ark of the Covenant into the most holy place within God's house. And it was then there in the temple that it became filled with the great cloud of God's Shekinah glory. And Solomon, he humbly realized that even a glorious temple, it could not contain the Lord of hosts. Yet nevertheless, following its dedication, God appears to Solomon. And he warns him of the consequences that Israel would face if they turned away from him. In fact, he promised him in one of the most familiar verses that we know in all of the Old Testament. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and I will heal their land. God also promised Solomon something else. He promised him a royal dynasty if he remained faithful, but disaster if he and Israel followed after other gods. And as usual, God's timing, it was impeccable, because after all of the pomp and circumstance that surrounded the temple's dedication, Solomon, he needed a reminder that all of the ceremony, it was all for naught if there was not obedience. You know, the daily grind of making the right choices and rejecting temptation, stuff like that. And so the years, they start to roll by, and the sense we get is that when you live such a rock star sort of life, that it's easy to drift. I mean, think about it. Solomon spends 7 years building the temple, but he spends 13 years building his own house. Shouldn't those numbers have been reversed? And as we're able to gather from a book that Solomon wrote at the end of his life, the book of Ecclesiastes, that Solomon came to a place where he decided to try everything there was to try under the sun. And folks, he tried it all. And then, as we read in today's lesson, to top it off, he marries hundreds of foreign pagan women. And so all of Solomon's wisdom and his riches, they couldn't make up for his bad choices to collect things and to fill his life with empty hobbies and pursuits, to fill up the void because he turned away from God. And perhaps no single decision led to such a turning away than his marrying of all those foreign women. So folks, Solomon's story, it's one that begins with such promise. And yet, just as his two predecessors, Saul and David, things start out so well, but they end up so badly. Because Solomon would spend his last days fighting off enemies and rebels, and his splendor and his legacy, they become tarnished by disobedience and idolatry. And as we're going to see next week, his kingdom, it gets split in two. What a sad ending for the king who had it all, who ultimately failed in the only thing that really matters in life, and that is finishing well. So I want us to spend our remaining time today sort of deconstructing the story of Solomon and gleaning a couple of key discoveries that I think are instructive for us so that we don't make the same mistake. And although the story today is not specific, it's instructive. Let's consider this question. Exactly where did it all go wrong for Solomon? What was the tipping point? And a guy that I knew several years ago, I think he's able to help us here, because he managed the quality assurance function for a big national phone company. And he was asked to perform what's called a root cause analysis when it came to figuring out why the on-time connections of his company seemed to be under par. And what he discovered was that sometimes it was a field engineer Maybe they were cutting corners on testing. Sometimes it was a supplier defect, and other times it was a salesperson who was writing verbal checks that the network engineering couldn't cash. And although it's only speculation, in the case of Solomon, I think we can hazard some guesses about when his train started veering off the tracks. Maybe it all started way back when he first married Pharaoh's daughter. And maybe that allegiance, maybe it opened the door just enough to rationalize all those hundreds of marriages to those foreign women later on. Or maybe it was an out-of-control libido. I mean, listen to Solomon's words. We read them today from Eugene Peterson's The Message. You know the saying, drink from your own rain barrel, draw water from your own spring-fed well? Well, it's true. Otherwise, you may one day come home and find your barrel empty and your well polluted. Your spring water is for you and you only, not to be passed around among strangers. Bless your fresh flowing fountain. Enjoy the wife you married as a young man, lovely as an angel, beautiful as a rose. Don't ever quit taking delight in her. Never take her love for granted. Why would you trade enduring intimacies for cheap thrills, for a dalliance with a promiscuous stranger? I mean, isn't it ironic, folks, that the guy who wrote all of that, as he writes it, he's married to 700 wives, 300 concubines. Could it have been an overactive libido? Solomon certainly wouldn't be the last guy, would he, ladies, to suffer a long-term consequence from a misplaced sex drive? Or maybe Solomon's taproot decision that began his descent was one of commerce. Maybe it was the development of a trade route, or maybe it was some large-scale NAFTA kind of agreements that eventually led to an exchange, of personnel, and that led to intermarrying, which then led his heart away from God. Friends, I submit to you that a root cause analysis in our own lives is essential. It's crucial that we undertake sort of an excavation of the nucleus of our own behaviors. Because you see, that breaks the cycle. It keeps us from repeating the same mistakes over and over again. And let me tell you, in about 35 years of ministry, I've literally done hundreds of funerals. It's the nature of what I get to do, that when I look into a person's life to prepare a message about them, I get to look at the root cause analysis of those that I get to send home. And I can't begin to tell you how many faithful saints I've had the privilege of sending home in the root cause analysis of their lives. It's a joy to behold. But I've also seen my fair share of folks, let me tell you, who left a lot on the playing field of life, who didn't end well. So if I can encourage you today that if you find yourself in a tough spot or in a rut or in a season of estrangement from God because of a besetting sin or hurt pride because you lost your job or whatever, then stop and do some root cause analysis. Folks, in Proverbs, Solomon gives us the key to such a practice, because there he says, the wisdom of the prudent is to give thought to their ways, but the folly of the fool is deception. Yeah, the wisdom of the wise is to give thought to their ways. In other words, the wise think about where they're going. You may not realize it, but actually, root cause analysis, it's very biblical. Here's how I know. Deuteronomy 32, it declares, Israel is a nation without sense. They have no wisdom at all. They fail to see why they were defeated. They cannot understand what happened. Translation? They just didn't get it. This is why you and I need to regularly recalibrate where we're going. Look in your bulletins with me this morning on the front page. You'll see there a diagram. It's called Recalibrating Your Life. You see, this is what Solomon failed to consider. Notice point A at the center. At point A, a small deviation from true north, it may not seem like a big deal. But you know, the further out you go, then the further from center you get. Well, look out at the third arc on the outside, arc C. That's 4 times greater than arc A. So how did Solomon end up where he did, worshiping all those other gods? Very gradually. One decision at a time, one rationalization at a time. Yeah, wise people think about where they're going. Will the path that I am walking on, will it lead me to a path of where I want to go? And if I keep heading this way, will I like where I will end up? How many of you remember one of my favorite movies, Groundhog Day? Let's see the hands. It's about a guy that keeps reliving the same day over and over again. Well, let me ask you, if you were doomed to live the same life over and over again for all of eternity, would you choose the life that you are living now? And that's an interesting question, because the kicker, it's the unspoken, potentially devastating follow-up. If the answer is no, then why are you living the life that you are now? I'll just sort of let that marinate there for a moment. Folks, the first thing is to stop kidding ourselves and to get to the core of the issue. A root cause analysis. But the second key, it's just as important. You see, a common Hebrew word for wisdom is the word chokmah. It's a word that's used to refer to the skill, the experience of a craftsman. Exodus 31 uses this word to describe the skill that a certain craftsman had to have to build the tabernacle after the Israelites escaped from Egypt. So a craftsman is called wise, if so, that at least part of that wisdom, what it means is the art of skillful living. That means becoming a craftsman, guys, and loving our wives and raising our kids and handling our money and living our lives. Yeah, this is why today's second truth is so important. Folks, keep practicing. You see, what happens to a skill or a craft if you stop honing it or practicing it is that you lose your muscle memory. You lose your edge. You get sloppy. And that's why chokmah or wisdom, it doesn't really have anything to do with your IQ, but it has everything to do with living a practiced life. You remember how Solomon's always talking in the Proverbs about the sluggards, about being lazy? Well, he's not talking about someone who's in love with their remote control. He's talking about a person with great potential. Somebody with all of these possibilities, but they squander their gifts. It's not about SAT scores. It's about misspent promise. Somebody that immediately comes to mind is a golfer, John Daly. Remember him? If you don't know him, John's this big, beefy guy. In the last 15 years on the PGA Tour, he had enough talent to win 2 majors. But he also blew through 4 wives, and by his own reckoning, between $50 and $60 million. He drinks like a sailor. He smokes like a chimney. And he's been in and out of rehabs more time than you can count. He's been kicked out of multiple tournaments. And guess what? He brought it all on himself. And yet, what if this guy kept practicing? What if he hadn't frittered away all that talents and all that money? What if he had Hakma, wisdom? Folks, Solomon says that the wisdom of the prudent is to give thought to their ways. And the wise think about where they're going. They're intentional. They practice. And of course, want to know the supreme irony here? This is exactly what Solomon failed to do. Think about it. He had all this wisdom and all this wealth, but in the end, they were lost on a guy who squandered his gifts on pagan women and pagan gods and pagan stuff. I mean, look again at the diagram there in your bulletins. And do you see it? We have to plot the trajectory of where we're going. In other words, where will the choices that we're making land us? And as we look out at that outer circle, what kind of a life will I have 10 years and 15 years and 30 years from now? Will I finish well? Solomon did not finish well. You know, in all of my years of ministry, I've never met anyone who woke up one day and they declared, hey, I'm going to ruin my relationships with my family and I'm going to commit adultery today. I've never met a businessman who just out of the blue decided to embezzle from his company, and I've never met a housewife who just decided to become an alcoholic. But let me tell you, sadly, I've known men who lost their marriages and their businesses. And I've known women who had to be committed to rehab. And if you could talk with them, and I have many times, they could tell you, I didn't set out to end up this way. But down in our lower stories, down here in the trenches, it can seem like everybody else is having all the fun. Yeah, everybody else can do whatever they want, and here am I stuck with all these Bible rules that keep me from having all this fun. Solomon probably thought that those exotic women from all those exotic lands were so enticing that he deserved to enjoy them as his wives, and that certainly, he could find the willpower to reject compromising to their pagan gods. But you know what? God's story never changes. And it's not influenced by what we want, even though he might allow us to have it, like Solomon for a while. But ultimately, in his upper story, he's going to build his perfect community with or without you. So, friend, what's the trajectory of your life? If you plot it out, where will the choices that you are presently making land you? Because how we live our lives matters. We all are going to leave a lasting legacy behind. We can't afford to be clueless and wonder what in the world happened in the end. Too much is at stake. That means do a root cause analysis. Get to the heart of the matter. Get honest. Dig deep. And as well, keep practicing. Stay in the Word and in worship. And as well in accountability with others. Our prayer It has to be that we will not only begin well, but that we will also end well. After all, with God, it's never too late to get back into grace. His grace is always willing to pick us up and get us back on track. And if only Solomon would have done that. Pray with me. Father, whisper your grace in our ear, in our heart, that if we are on a trajectory in life that over the years will lead us far away from you, bring us back. Bring us back to you, back to where we need to be in your grace. Lead us back home again. We ask this in the name of your Son, Jesus.